During this period, as temples developed, the sculptural program starts to take on increasing importance. And one of the earliest examples in which we see a complex sculptural program on the outside of the temple is the Temple of Artemis in Corfu that was made between 600 and 500 BCE. I'm showing you the pediment as it exists today on the top, and obviously it only exists in certain fragments. And the museum that owns this, the Archaeological Museum in Corfu, has installed it in such a way that we can imagine what it might have looked like in its context. But you'll notice the sculptural reliefs we're looking at are the ones that project out in 3 dimensions, and then there's artist renderings of what the rest of it might have looked like. Obviously, the entire temple does not survive, but we do know that it was a Doric temple. And what we're looking at is, as I said, the west pediment. So this is what the sculptural relief might have looked like in its context. The pediment presented the Gorgon Medusa in the center. Here she is right here, and up here. I'm showing you also a detail on the right. And she is the central figure in the legend of Perseus. Perseus went to go and slay the famous Gorgon Medusa, who was known for being able to turn men to stone with her gaze. And she's often depicted with snakes for hair and wide eyes. We can see it better here. Wide eyes that show the power of her gaze. When Perseus goes to kill Medusa, he brings with him a shield that is polished to a high shine and can act as a mirror. And he shows her her own reflection, and it turns her to stone. You'll notice, however, that that is not the narrative that we see. She is presented, as I said, as the main central figure in this pediment, and she is acting as a protector figure to ward off evil and protect worshipers as they entered the temple. And she's often presented this way. She appears in other places, like on shields to protect warriors, for example. And we see several of her attributes, and I'll point out, for example, that her hair is made of snakes, and we even see one that's kind of escaped free and is loose and flowing. She has a sash made of snakes around her waist. She is presented as a winged figure as well, and we can see a little bit of her wing right here and perhaps over her shoulder. Again, it's hard to see, but this would be the artist's recreation of what it might have looked like. She also is represented, as I said, with eyes that are very wide, but she also has a snarling mouth with teeth bared. Often her tongue is poking out, and sometimes she has a bit of a beard. And it's really hard to tell, but she might have kind of whiskers below, or maybe some kind of goatee, or maybe that's just what the tongue is. But she is often presented in this way. She was meant to be extremely intimidating, kind of gazing down at people as they entered. On either side of her, she is flanked by her children. On this side would have been Pegasus, the winged horse, and you can tell Pegasus no longer exists. There's no fragment here, but her other child, Chrysler, is visible. We see him here. He would be here. We can see perhaps a better view right here. Chrysler is sometimes depicted as a winged boar. Her children were born after her death, strangely. She and Poseidon bore these 2 children when Perseus chopped off her head and threw it into the ocean. On either side of the children, we have two reclining felines here and here. And they are, one is completely present, and we have just the head of the other one here. As we've seen in the ancient Near East, feline or mythological figures often appear on gates as protector figures. And here, I think you can see in this close-up, especially if we look at the face and the stylized kind of concentric circles that imply the fur of the animal, you can see that it really does look very Persian. And so that influence from the ancient Near East is still present at this time in archaic Greek art. If we look at the figure of Medusa, we can see how it was constructed. First of all, it is very high relief, but it is not sculpture in the round yet. And so later on in the classical period, sculptures would be planted or staged right inside the pediment. We're seeing here instead that the figure has been carved in very high relief right out of a background, and it probably would have been carved in these panels, and then they would be assembled within the architectural frame, the pediment frame. The artist then has done their best to really create a lot of depth, even though this is high relief and not sculpture in the round. She has one foot, she has one knee that is jutting out into our space, and she's kind of twisting back with the other leg that goes back behind her. And so we get the sense that there is depth in the space, even though she is still attached to this flat background of the stone slab. This shallow pediment area does present a lot of problems with for the archaic Greek artists, and they've come up with some very interesting solutions. They're not perfect solutions. We'll see better solutions later on. But essentially, the problem is how to put a very complex composition within a space that has such a defined awkward space of this very shallow triangle. First of all, Medusa herself, who is the central figure, is the largest figure thanks to hieratic scale. So that's a pretty easy solution. She's in the center and she's the largest. Also, we have these two reclining feline figures, which, as they face each other, present a nice triangular composition. So that's helpful. But then when we get to the shallow ends of the triangle, it becomes more complicated. How do we fit in figural groups into the space that is now so narrow? The artist has decided to shrink down these figures and put one of them on their knees. And on the other side, we think that there was a reclining figure. So the artist is now creating poses that allow the figures to fit within this architectural framework. But some of them need to be shrunken down to a proportion that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Again, it's a bit of an awkward solution, but it is an attempt to use the framework of the architecture to create a narrative program. The other situation that has been solved with a somewhat awkward solution is how to tell a complex narrative in one frame. And you'll see that the artist has chosen not to depict the moment of Perseus killing Medusa, but rather having her stand in for the entire narrative. The artist could assume that visitors to this temple would be very much familiar with the narrative. And so they don't need to tell the whole story, but rather have chosen just the main character, the main figure, to stand in for the entire story. And finally, I just want to remind you, of course, that the original presentation of this relief would have been brightly painted with vivid colors. So we would have seen Medusa painted in different colors than the figures in the background, and it all would have stood out. It would have stood out from the facade of the building.